I am going to read the scripture today, but I wanted to remind everybody, since we've had a few weeks off of no Wednesday service, that this week we start back. So Wednesday night at 6:30. Geez, it's been a long time. 6:30, right, Tara? Okay. Okay. What a deal. Whoops. I'm going to read 1 Kings 18. I don't need it, Joanne, thanks. 20 to 40. That was my cheat sheet, but I already have it open, So Ahab sent a message among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him." But the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I alone am left, a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Now let them give us 2 oxen, and let them choose 1 ox for themselves and cut it up and place it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other ox and lay it on the wood, and I will not put a fire under it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people said, "That is a good idea." So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose 1 ox for yourselves and prepare it first, for you are many. And call on the name of your God, but put no fire under it." Then they took the ox which was given them, and they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they leaped about the altar, which they... I'll find it in a second. I hit the wrong button. That's the bad part about electronics, right? If you can't just flip a page. Almost there. And they leaped about the altar which they made. It came about at noon. Then Elijah mocked them and said, "Call out with a loud voice, for he is a god. Either he is occupied or gone aside, or is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and needs to be awakened." So they cried with a loud voice and cut themselves, according to their custom, with swords and lances until the blood gushed out on them. When the midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." So all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Israel shall be your name." So with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar, large enough to hold 2 measures of seed. Then he arranged the wood and cut the ox in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. The water flowed around the altar, and he also filled the trench with water. At the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." Then Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook and slew them there.
Yes, thank you. This painting on the slide is by Luca Giordano. It's called "The Sacrifice of Elijah Against the Prophets of Baal." It's in the Fine Arts Museum in San Francisco. Anybody been there? I haven't been to that one. But it's a characterization of the story you just heard read. This is a pretty famous text in Christian circles, especially in Protestant circles. I used to belong to a pastors' association, and this was probably the most favorite passage of several of those pastors. And it's kind of odd when you think about we're Christians and we follow Jesus, but hardly a meeting went by without somebody talking about this passage. And it was for various reasons. Often it had to do with some current affair that they felt like we were in a culture war with, and they would appeal to Elijah and his violent taking out of the enemies in their discussion. Now, I don't think any of them would have killed anybody in their in their culture wars, but this was an example of scripture for them. Other times they would refer to around this story. If you'd read it a little bit before, it's talking about King Ahab and his wife, who was named Jezebel. And Jezebel in this story is kind of a manipulative character, and she has a lot of the prophets of Judah put to death. And I would hear these pastors calling women in their congregations that were giving them a hard time Jezebels, and it used to make me grit my teeth, because nobody's being killed here, and if somebody's not understanding what you're talking about or asking questions, I don't think that's appropriate to be calling them Jezebel. That's quite an accusation. They understood and they praised Elijah for calling fire down from heaven. Now, in the New Testament, there's a story where we've talked about quite a bit, where Jesus sends his disciples out ahead of him. They go into a village of Samaria. Those Samaritans don't receive Jesus, and his disciples come back and say, "Should we call fire down from heaven on this village, Jesus?" And Jesus says, "No, you don't know what spirit you're of to even ask that question." So we get a very different view in the New Testament about calling judgment fire down on people's heads. But often we don't try to segregate those views when we go back into the Old Testament. So that's what I want to have us think about a little bit today. And I've entitled this, "How to Win the Battle and Lose the War." And that might come clear. And you may disagree, and that's fine, about how this worked. But a lot of those pastors saw this as kind of the ultimate cage match between God and his enemies. It's almost like there's a ring here, and two altars are set up, and the prophets of Baal are calling on their God, and Elijah calls on his God. It's almost like this big cage match from God opposing the forces of darkness. Now, where it took place this is in the time of the kings, so the nation of Israel was divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom at this time. So the yellow area, which you see as Israel, represents the northern kingdom, which included 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom, Judah, just contained the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. So those only 2 tribes in the lower section, 10 tribes in the northern section, but all Israel, all God's people. It's just they had a little bit of a falling out, kind of like what churches have sometimes, and they split for a while into 2 denominations, if you will. Elijah was from Judah, but the events in this story happened primarily up in the northern kingdom, and you see that little peninsula sticking out there in the yellow. I don't know if you can read it, but that's Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel was a ridge of mountains that runs right up to the Mediterranean Sea, and there are some cliffs there at the Mediterranean Sea at Mount Carmel. So the story, the match, if you will, takes place there on Mount Carmel in the northern kingdom. So it's important to realize that Ahab, the king, was not an enemy of Israel. He was a king of Israel. And the people in that region were not enemies of God. They were God's people. They were the children of Israel, just in the northern kingdom of Israel. Baal, though, or I'll call it Baal. I think the correct pronunciation might be Baal, but we'll go with Baal because that's easy to say. Was a fertility god. Now, not necessarily human fertility, but for soil. So the god of the Baal god was also referred to as the god of wind or rain or storm god. He was actually referred to as he who rides on the clouds, much like we see even Yahweh God being referred to in the scriptures. So at this time, there was still a lot of debate going on about the gods of the pantheon, gods of the universe. and their characteristics. So many of the characteristics that we've come to associate with Yahweh God, with God, also the pagan cultures also associated with their gods. Elijah comes up from the southern kingdom to confront Ahab. Ahab and his wife Jezebel had killed most of the prophets from the southern kingdom, although Obadiah had set apart 100 of them and saved them from being killed. So there was kind of a battle going on between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom at this point, and a lot of the southern prophets were put to death by Ahab. So Elijah was hiding out, and Ahab had kind of a price on his head and had been chasing him around Israel and Judah, but had been unable to find him. So it's kind of a gutsy move for Elijah to come out of Judah, come all the way up into Mount Carmel, which is deep into the northern kingdom, and call for this confrontation. All these cultures, though, around the ancient Near East were very sacrificial in their thinking at the time. They all, including Israel, thought that God or the gods required humans to offer sacrifices to them to keep them appeased or to keep them happy or to cause them to send rain and sun and all the things they needed to survive. So this was the common way of thinking. You know, we have to remind ourselves when we read these texts, it's like Dr. Enns was saying, they were a very tribal people. They were segregated into tribes. They all had very similar ideas about deities, and the deities were not happy people. For the most part, they were hard to please and hard to keep pleased. And that comes through in even a lot of our Old Testament biblical texts, the way people thought of God. So Elijah makes this challenge in verses 20 and 21. So Ahab sent to all the Israelites and assembled the prophets at Mount Carmel. Elijah then came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go limping with two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." The people did not answer him a word. Now, I can imagine that they didn't answer maybe for a number of reasons. Maybe they were just listening to hear the rest of the story, or maybe they were in a very oppressive or repressive society here under King Ahab and Jezebel. It would have maybe been dangerous for them to speak out at this point, and in agreement especially with Elijah, because they kind of knew what had befallen the other prophets like him. But this is a classic prophetic challenge. The prophets always tended to go to they were the voice that spoke to power. They would go and confront the powerful figures, calling them to straighten out and reign justly. The people remained silent. Maybe they were afraid of Jezebel or Ahab. And then he continues with the challenge in verse 24. "Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire is indeed God." And all the people answered, "Well spoken." Now he gets some agreement from people. What is it that gets him to get agreement? The God who answers by fire is indeed God. So everybody was agreed on that the gods are associated with fire, that there is a connection between the gods and fire. And that's why we read in the Old Testament and also other texts from around this time that burnt offerings they understood as sending, and you put a carcass on a fire, the smoke would rise up, and they thought that smoke went into the nostrils of their gods and was a pleasing aroma to them. You can probably remember texts reading like that. There was a clear association, not just in Jews, but all around this region, that the gods were associated with fire. The rules of engagement now are set for this match. You set up one altar, you put a bull on yours, I'll set up another altar, I'll put a bull on mine, and we'll see whose God responds. Let the match begin. And the prophets of Baal go first. So they took the bull that was given them, prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, crying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice and no answer. They limped about the altar that they had made. So several hours go by, and nothing happens. And this word limping shows up again. Remember earlier it said when Elijah issues the challenge, he says, why do you people go on limping between one opinion and another opinion? And then it shows up again here. Matt's been practicing his Hebrew translation, and he pointed this out to me. And he goes, that's an odd word in that passage. It shows up twice. And when something shows up twice and it's kind of an odd word like this, maybe we ought to ask why. I was thinking about it this morning. And if in the first instance, he says, why do you go limping about between two different opinions? Now they're at the altar. The prophets of Baal are gathering around, imploring their God to send fire. And the narrator says they're limping about the altar. I wonder what that means. Maybe their dance that they're doing was halting or limping like that. But maybe it also could mean that they weren't so sure of what they were doing either. That they were faltering between two opinions. Just like in the first instance, he's saying, why do you choose, you can't make up your mind between who you're going to serve. You can't make up your mind which God you're going to serve. Maybe the same thing is going on with the prophets of Baal. Maybe they're not so sure of themselves now that the man of God, the great prophet Elijah, has come and laid down the gauntlet. He has kind of a rep, just like Ahab did, of calling fire down from heaven. So maybe they're not quite so sure of themselves. Not sure what the significance of that is, but that's just an interesting thought. So they call out to their God from morning till noon. Nothing happens. And then Elijah starts to taunt them and mock them. At noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, surely he is God. Either he is meditating, or he's wandered away, or he's on a journey. Or maybe he's asleep and must be awakened. So Elijah starts throwing these taunts at the prophets of Baal. What is he doing? He's injecting doubt into the whole situation. Because you have the crowd of all the Israelites standing around watching this event. And when you start throwing insults and mocking the people that all the attention is focused on, what does it do? It injects doubt in the crowd. That's a very political move to do. We see these politicians doing this all the time. They mock the other candidate. Why are they doing that? They're doing that to try to get the people to turn to their side. So Elijah's doing a very political thing here. He's mocking these prophets of Baal in a deliberate way, and I think he's trying to draw the people away from them and to himself. They'd been drawn into idol worship, but nothing seemed to be responding here. Then their response after the mocking is they cried aloud, and as was their custom, they cut themselves with swords and lances until the blood gushed out over them. As midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, but there was no voice, no answer, and no response. So they began cutting themselves. It's an ever-increasing display of religious zeal. It's this meeting where they're just doing anything they can think of to try to get something to happen. Sadly, I've been in some meetings like that, where we feel like if we can show God we're earnest enough that maybe he'll do something special for us. That's kind of what I see happening here. Pagan religion understood the gods as requiring acts like this in order to please them or appease them. But what kind of acts had they been doing? So what had got Elijah's ire up? Well, in 2 chapters before this, we see the kind of sacrifices the prophets of Baal had been offering. Here's back in 1 Kings 16:34. In Ahab's days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho, and he laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub. Now, this is not talking about that his 2 sons got killed in a construction accident while they were building this structure. It means that Ahab sacrificed his 2 sons in the building of Jericho. Human sacrifice. Pagans would often sacrifice children to the patron god of the city or the building they were building, and then place their body in the foundation of the building as an offering to the gods in order to seek their blessing. So the practice that Elijah was pushing against was human sacrifice. You guys set up Jericho, you set up this, and you're allowing the whole northern kingdom of Israel to be influenced by this this abomination that God really finds abhorrent. Again, in 2 Kings 16, here's another passage. And he followed the example of the kings of Israel, even causing his son to pass through fire, copying the shameful practices of the nations which Yahweh had dispossessed for the sons of Israel. He offered sacrifices and incense on the high places, on the hills, and under every spreading tree. So causing children to pass through the fire is another euphemism for child sacrifice. Now, they would actually have stone figures with hands outstretched, and they would actually lay infant children on them, and they'd be burned alive. The high places were the altars that they built up where they did this. So this is the backstory. This is what Elijah is pushing against. He's pushing against the idea that we offer the very fruit of our bodies to God in order to procure his blessing for us. When Elijah said, "The God who answers by fire is indeed God," when he said that, this is what would have been going through their minds. The God who answers by fire, these sort of sacrifices. But when he said that, he was kind of showing his cards. He was showing that he too, even though he was coming to resist this, he too was thoroughly indoctrinated in this way of thinking, in this sacrificial mindset that so many people were in then. And the people were too, because remember when he said that, the people said, "Well spoken." So this is the nature of the culture we're talking about now. Human and animal sacrifices were significant. So this story of Elijah calling for fire to consume a sacrifice takes place in a thoroughly sacrificial culture. It's how they understood the world to work, where they believed that sacrifices pleased the gods. And God sends Elijah to challenge these practices, but Elijah challenges these sacrificial practices with sacrifice. He comes and offers another kind of sacrifice against the kind of sacrifice that he's actually railing against. So the Old Testament is actually a gradual it's a record of the gradual understanding of people in that time that God doesn't require sacrifice, that's not what God is about. But it takes time, and it comes by fits and starts, and even the great prophet Elijah was confused about it to a certain degree. It's a difficult transition for those people to make. You can imagine it. If the air you breathe is, we need to make the appropriate sacrifices in order for God to send rain and to make our crops fertile, and it's a fearsome thing to push against that if that's how everybody in your culture thinks. It was integral to the way they thought of the world. But remember, when God stopped Abraham from sacrificing Isaac and sent in his place a ram, that was the beginning of God trying to overturn that understanding, that idea that a firstborn son is pleasing to God as a sacrifice. And then all throughout the Old Testaments, we see the prophets begin to challenge this sacrificial worldview. They wrote things like this. And I've got several passages here that we can see challenge sacrificial thinking. "I despise your festivals," this is God speaking, "and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them, and the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon." So some of the prophets, here's the prophet Amos, bringing a minority report into Israel. This is a minority report, because the world of the Old Testament, the ancient Near East, was a thoroughly sacrificial culture all around that world. So for somebody to say, "Hey, God doesn't, I will not accept your offerings," that's a radical thing to say at that time. It's a completely turning over of their understanding of what the gods were expected. And then in Psalm 40, we see something similar. "Sacrifice and offering you do not desire, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required." Well, this is a drastic, radical statement, because the whole of Leviticus and much of the law that Moses brought was about this whole elaborate sacrificial system. So you can try to harmonize these things, but I think that's a futile attempt. I tried to harmonize these for a long time, and I think it gets you nowhere. But I think if you recognize that God is doing something, he's trying to move people out of a certain way of thinking, and when Jesus finally arrives, we see that he's purely anti-sacrificial in his thinking. Micah 6, another prophet. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? There's human sacrifice. The fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? So that's all one passage. So the first section there is saying, should I bring all of these offerings to you, God? But then verse 8 tells us, no, what God requires is justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly. Can anybody say amen to that? I mean, I'm glad I don't have to bring bulls and slaughter them and offer my sons and daughters to God. Imagine what this would have sounded like to people in that culture. I imagine they were torn by it because their whole heritage, their whole religious texts and what they'd been told about from their forefathers was against this idea. So it's a radical change. And then Jeremiah says something amazing in Jeremiah 7. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, add your burnt offerings to your sacrifices and eat the flesh. He's kind of like mocking them. And then he goes on and says, for in the day that I brought your ancestors out of the land of Egypt, I did not speak to them or command them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. What's he talking about? He's talking about when Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt through the wilderness and gave them the law that says you must sacrifice, and gave a whole list of parameters about how sacrifice must be done. Jeremiah says, that wasn't me. That wasn't me saying that. It wasn't me teaching you all of those methods of sacrifice. See, that's a remarkable verse, verse 22. In the day that I brought your ancestors out of the land of Egypt, I did not speak to them or command them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. Well, where did they get it from? They got it from their culture, because everybody thought that's the way the gods were. They all thought that's what the gods expected. But Jeremiah later says, no, that actually wasn't me. Woo. God didn't have to institute sacrificial religion because sacrificial religion was already in place. That's what all the cultures thought religion was about. Jeremiah goes on to say in verse 23, but this command I gave them. So God then says what he did require. Obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you will be my people, and walk only in the way that I command you, so that it may be well with you. God didn't command that they perform sacrifices in addition to obeying him. He said he only required that they obey him. No sacrifices required. And finally, Hosea 6, we see this. For I desire steadfast love or mercy and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. So sometimes you can read these texts and find that there is a mixture of them understanding that God wanted some sacrifice, but also wanted their obedience. By the time you get to Hosea, he's saying, no, I don't even want sacrifice. I desire love and mercy, not sacrifice. And we know Jesus later sides with this tradition where he numerous times tells the Pharisees, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So Jesus picks up in the prophetic tradition and leads us away from this sacrificial kind of thinking. So back to Elijah and the prophets of Baal. The prophets of Baal are unable to convince their God to consume the sacrifice. And Elijah goes ahead and prepares his altar, and he douses it with water. In verse 37, it says, answer me, O Lord, answer me, so that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and even licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord indeed is God, the Lord indeed is God." Battle over. Elijah has shown the people whose God is the real God. No question. The people fall on their faces and they confess, "The Lord is God, the Lord is God indeed." Elijah has accomplished what he set out to do. He's turned the people back away from the gods of Baal to Yahweh. Happy ending, right? All's well that ends well, except for verse 40. Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, do not let one of them escape." And then they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the wadi, or the river Kishon, and killed them all there. So this entire scene where Elijah goes to Ahab to rescue God's people from practicing human sacrifice ends with Elijah practicing human sacrifice. So he's still complicit in this way of thinking. He still doesn't quite understand where God is trying to lead humanity away from. It wasn't a ritual killing, but it certainly was a massacre. It was actually, I think, retribution for what Jezebel had done to the other prophets of Judah, because Jezebel had gone about killing many of those prophets. So there's a little bit of God in this story, and there's a lot of Elijah in this story. There's a little anti-sacrificial thinking in this story, but there's still a lot of sacrificial thinking in this story. Elijah had won the battle, but in his final act, he loses the war by being very un-Christ-like, un-God-like in how he dealt with the prophets of Baal. I mean, they were thoroughly discredited at this point. The whole nation was out and saw what had happened, and they'd been thoroughly discredited. I mean, what was the need to slay them all now? There's no recognition here of "I require mercy and not sacrifice." Elijah sacrifices the whole lot of them. So Ahab tells Jezebel what had happened. So Ahab the king tells his wife Jezebel, and she vows to kill Elijah. So here we go again, the circle of retribution. And Elijah takes off and flees. He makes his way to Horeb, which is back in Judah, and he's hiding out in a cave. And God asks him what he's doing there. And Elijah says, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left." Actually, he knows he's not the only one left, because in chapter 18, in the beginning, Obadiah says, "I saved 100 of you guys. They're hid away in caves." So he's just feeling sorry for himself. He's feeling sorry because now his killing of the prophets of Baal has raised the ire of Jezebel against him personally, and he's on the run. The mighty Elijah, who just won this great victory, is now hiding out in fear of Jezebel. This is where these pastors in this pastor association really railed against Elijah. Oh, what a failure! What a weak link! You know, I mean, he was the mighty Elijah. Why didn't he take it to Jezebel too? You know, but he's feeling the results of this kind of working, this sacrificial thinking. So God tells him, "Go out, stand on the mountain, because I'm going to pass by you." The Lord is going to go and pass by. So he's hiding out in a cave in Horeb. God comes to him and says, "Come out of the cave, stand here, and you'll see me pass by." And then if you read the text, it's all in chapter 19 of 1 Kings, you read that an earthquake shook the earth, but it says, "But the Lord was not in the earthquake." And then rain, violent wind rather, comes and blows, even so violent that it says it broke the rocks. But it says, but the Lord wasn't in the wind either. And next, fire comes. And it says the Lord was not in the fire. Wait a minute. The Lord is not in the fire? Remember back when Elijah issued his challenge, he said, "The God who answers by fire is indeed the Lord." But here, when he's hiding out in a cave and the Lord comes to him and speaks to him, he says, "Stand here and I'm going to pass by." But when the fire comes, the Lord says he wasn't in the fire. Remember, he had said, you call on the name of your God and I'll call on the name of my God. And the God who answers by fire is God indeed. But God was not found in the fire. Then after the fire, there was a sound of silence. And then eventually a still small voice comes, and he hears God in that voice. So if you take this whole story, you see that Elijah expected, like everybody else, for God to be found in the fire. But later he finds that that's not where God resides. He resides in our hearts. He resides in our ability to listen for him and to open our lives to him. He resides in that place where we're willing to be spoken to by God. That's where we find him. He was found in silence. And then God gives him his next assignment, which included a prophecy that there would be more bloodshed to follow. Well, yeah, we know why, because when you begin with bloodshed, there will be more bloodshed to follow. Probably the bloodshed that was to come was likely a direct result of Elijah's killing the prophets. It just kind of goes around and around. But God also promised to save 7,000 who had not bowed to Baal. So there's this dialogue that bounces back and forth through the Old Testament, where we find the voice of God and we find the voice of the culture of the time. We find often that God is being portrayed as being the God that everybody thought he was. But we see over time, if we're patient and we work through it, that God is trying to move us along. So, for discussion today, here's a couple of questions. What might have happened if Elijah had not killed the prophets of Baal? How could the story have been different? So I'm representing it that Elijah won the battle. He didn't need to go and slay the 450 prophets of Baal. They were thoroughly discredited, and it appears to me with the limping that maybe they were on the fence at this point anyway. Maybe they were not sure of themselves. What other contest could Elijah have proposed? This whole contest was set up in the midst of a drought. They were 3 years into a drought. And then we see in the text later that the drought was broken after this. But it was broken when Elijah fell on his face on the ground and prayed to God, and then rain came. This was right after he killed the 450 prophets. So was it the killing of the prophets that caused the drought to be broken? Or was it Elijah falling on his face and praying before God that caused the drought to be broken? So there's just a couple of questions. What do you think?